Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're all doing great. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing folks from all over the place tuning in. Single dad CEO meets mom with 3 kids begging for food. What he learns shocks him. Late in the afternoon, the sky over Maple Hollow shifted to a strange, dull gray. Clouds churned above, foretelling an unusual storm in the middle of autumn. Ethan Caldwell gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck, his eyes heavy with exhaustion as he stared down the long, rocky road ahead. Not long ago, he had owned everything. A billion-dollar healthcare empire, a penthouse in the heart of the city, lavish parties, and handshakes loaded with hidden agendas. But that world had crumbled overnight. Betrayal, lawsuits, loss. Now Ethan had nothing left but a lakeside house in Maple Hollow, fading memories, and a trust in people worn down to the bone. He didn't expect anything good to come out of this small, forgotten town. Then at the bend near the end of the road, he saw them. A woman, thin, wrapped in a worn-out coat that barely shielded her from the biting wind. Beside her stood 3 children, a girl around 10 years old clutching a smaller boy tightly, and another girl huddled close, tiny hands trembling as she held up a crumpled piece of paper scribbled with the words, "Please help." The sight hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. He slammed on the brakes, so hard the truck skidded across the damp dirt. The woman lifted her head, her gaze locking with his through the dusty windshield. A long, breathless moment passed. There was no blatant pleading, no demands, only exhaustion, despair, and something else. A fragile, desperate glimmer of hope. Ethan turned off the engine and stepped out. The smell of wet grass and cold air jolted his senses awake. "Do you need some help?" His voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. The woman gave a small nod, then shook her head, a heartbreaking contradiction, pride battling pure survival instinct. We just need a little food," she said softly. "That's all." The youngest boy, no more than 4 years old, clung tightly to her coat, wide eyes reflecting a fear no child should ever have to know. Ethan glanced at the crumpled paper in her hand, then at his empty truck. A strange awkwardness welled up inside him. He wasn't used to giving without expecting something in return, at least not like this. Years among the elite had taught him that kindness always came with strings attached. But now, standing before this woman and her frail children, no such strings existed in his mind. "My house is just up the hill," he said, pointing toward the small trail leading to his lakeside home. "It's not far. There's food. It's warm. You can rest if you want." A strong gust of wind whipped through, making the woman shiver. She hesitated, glancing down at her children. The older girl squeezed her mother's hand tightly, whispering something Ethan couldn't hear, but he read it clearly on the girl's face. A fragile trust given once more. "We won't be any trouble," the woman murmured, almost apologetically. Ethan nodded, motioning for them to follow. As they walked, he noticed how the 3 children clung tightly to their mother, every step cautious, as if afraid that any misstep would send their world crashing down again. Ethan's lakeside house wasn't big, but it was warm. The fireplace glowed with a soft amber light, casting a soothing warmth across the room. Quickly, Ethan pulled together a simple dinner: reheated vegetable soup, toasted bread, and warm milk. When he set the bowl of soup in front of the youngest child, the little boy stared up at him with eyes full of both gratitude and suspicion, as if expecting some invisible trap to spring. No one talked much. They ate as if each spoonful of soup was a miracle. Ethan sat quietly at the head of the table, watching them, feeling a part of his heart, long thought dead, stirred to life. After dinner, he poured tea and dug out a few old coats from his closet for them to use. When everything had calmed, the woman finally sat across from him, her hands trembling around a chipped teacup. "I'm Grace," she said, her voice rough from cold and exhaustion. "Grace Hamilton. And these are Ella, Sophie, and Ben." Ethan nodded, offering a faint smile. "Ethan Caldwell." A heavy silence fell. Then Grace, as if she couldn't hold it in any longer, spoke in a rush, her voice thick with emotion. "We're not scammers. We're not professional beggars. We're running. Ethan tilted his head slightly, saying nothing, just waiting. Grace gripped her hands together so tightly her nails dug into her palms. Running from the man who used to be my husband. A man with money, power, but no heart. Her words came in broken fragments. Nights spent sleeping on sidewalks, moments spent hiding, the cold stares from strangers. Ethan didn't pry. He didn't need to. The truth was etched into every tremble of her voice, every tear she tried so hard not to shed. He clenched his hands on his knees, wrestling with a feeling he barely recognized. Not pity, but a deep, painful understanding. The day he lost everything, the people he thought were friends had turned their backs. He, too, had known the hollow ache of being cast out, forgotten when he needed someone the most. And tonight, Ethan knew what he had to do. "You can stay here," he said, his voice low but certain, "for as long as you need, until you figure out what's next." Grace looked up, disbelief flickering across her face. Ella clutched her little brother and whispered something in his ear that made the boy smile, his first smile that night. In that moment, in that small lakeside house with a storm howling outside, a new family began to form, not by blood but by choice. None of them knew yet that the past would soon come knocking. But tonight, there was only light, the fragile, precious light of a new beginning. The soft morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting a pale golden glow over the small room. Ethan stood by the sink, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, his gaze quietly following Grace's reflection in the glass. She sat at the kitchen table, her hair tousled, her hands nervously fidgeting with the rim of her teacup, as if it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. In the living room, the three children slept soundly, the first uninterrupted night they'd had in what must have felt like forever. Ethan hadn't asked much the night before. He understood some stories needed time to unfold, needed space to breathe. But today, he could feel it. Grace wanted to speak. Or rather, she needed to lift the crushing weight pressing down on her chest. He set his cup down, pulled out a chair, and sat across from her. No pressure, no rush, just presence, patient and steady. Grace clutched the teacup tighter, drew a deep breath, and began, her voice small but steady, like a trickling stream carving its way through solid stone. "Have you ever heard of Richard Hamilton?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the edge of the table. Ethan frowned slightly. The name stirred up an old, bitter memory. Richard Hamilton, CEO of Hamilton Global Tech, infamous for hostile takeovers of small companies, crushing them or stealing their inventions. He took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness soaking into the roots of his memory. He nodded. "Yeah, I know him. Very well." Grace let out a hollow laugh, devoid of any joy. "He's my ex-husband." For a moment, the air between them seemed to freeze. Ethan set his cup down carefully, tension coiling through his body, though his voice remained calm. "Why did you leave him?" Grace looked up then, meeting his gaze for the first time that morning, raw, unguarded. "Because I realized, if I stayed, my children would never know freedom, or love, or kindness." She began to tell her story, each memory falling out slowly, sharp as broken glass. Richard, polished, dangerously charming, overwhelmingly powerful, had once made Grace, a dreamy art student, believe she was living in a fairy tale. But just months after the extravagant wedding, the mask slipped. Control, insults, ridiculous rules about how to dress, how to speak, even how to smile in public. One by one, everything she loved, painting, books, friendships, was squeezed out of her life. The children came, but instead of softening Richard, they became new tools for his domination. Any tiny flaw, a laugh too loud, a stain on a shirt, was enough to trigger his wrath. One night, when Grace found a bruise on little Sophie's wrist, a lesson, Richard said, to teach obedience, she knew she had no choice left. She spent 3 months preparing in secret, hoarding spare change in grocery bags, hiding away important documents, memorizing the quiet bus stations. Then, on a misty August night under a faint moon, she fled the golden caged mansion she had once thought would be her paradise, clutching her 3 children in her arms. When she finished, her hands were trembling slightly, her eyes red but dry, refusing to shed another tear. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, his fists clenched on the table until his knuckles turned white. In his mind, old puzzle pieces began snapping together into a far uglier picture than he had imagined. He took a deep breath, forcing his voice steady. Hamilton, 3 years ago, his company took over one of my subsidiaries. Grace's eyes widened, her breath catching. Ethan went on, every word cutting into him like a blade. We were developing a breakthrough rehabilitation technology, a project I poured my soul into. When I refused to hand over the rights, he unleashed a storm of rumors to destroy my reputation and buried us in lawsuits. A bitter, dry laugh escaped Ethan. I lost everything. The company, my friends, the future I had built in my dreams. The silence wrapped around them again, heavy as a winter blanket. Outside, the wind began to whistle, spinning dry leaves across the porch. Then Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his voice rough. This world is either too small, or fate is far too cruel. Grace pressed her lips together, a sob buried deep in her chest. Not for Richard anymore, but for the shared loneliness, the strange and aching injustice that tied these two strangers together. What did you do after it all fell apart? She whispered. Ethan turned his head, his gaze steady now, no longer clouded with despair, but glinting with quiet, stubborn fire. I lived, he said. I rebuilt, even if all I had left were 2 empty hands and a shredded belief in humanity. His voice softened. And now, maybe I'm not so alone after all. Grace lowered her head, silent tears slipping down her fingers. Without a word, Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. No demand, no expectations, only a steady, unyielding presence against the storm. Outside, the rain began to fall, a soft, rhythmic backdrop to 2 broken hearts quietly stitching themselves back together with a fragile red thread of courage. Inside the old lakeside house, where 2 people who had lost everything now sat facing each other, a new alliance was quietly being born, not from hatred, but from the stubborn, beautiful belief that while the past might be shattered, the future is still something you get to choose. The night wind cut cold through the bare trees of Maple Hollow. Inside the old lakeside house Ethan Caldwell had rebuilt into a temporary home for his little family. Warm light glowed through fogged-up windows. Upstairs, laughter rang out as Ella, Sophie, and Ben played mischievously with Jackson, Ethan's son. In the living room, Grace sat carefully mending a tear in one of the children's jackets, while Ethan rested by the fireplace, his old guitar leaning against his knee. A peaceful night, a night like any other, except for the weight pressing heavy against Ethan's chest. A feeling, a silent alarm. He stood up, checking the front windows. Nothing but darkness and the faint chorus of insects. But as he turned back toward the living room, a faint, acrid scent drifted through the air. Ethan froze. A split second later, a small explosion rocked the backyard, throwing a flash of red fire up into the night sky. Fire! Ethan shouted, bolting through the hallway, heart pounding in his ears. Grace rushed out from the laundry room, panic written across her face. The kids! I'll get them! Ethan barked, shoving her toward the back door. Call the fire department. Get them out now. Another explosion, stronger this time, sent thick black smoke billowing from the workshop, clear evidence of accelerants. This wasn't an accident. Ethan knew it instantly. No time to think. He sprinted upstairs 2 steps at a time, yelling for the kids, his eyes burning from the smoke. Ella and Sophie stumbled from the bedroom, coughing, while Jackson tugged Ben along by the hand. Downstairs, Ethan ordered hoarsely, "Follow your mom. Now!" The kids raced for the stairs where Grace was waiting to lead them out, but Sophie's panic cry made Ethan stop cold. "Matthew's still in the room," she screamed, pointing down the hallway. Without hesitation, Ethan dove into the smoke-choked corridor. Matthew's bedroom was already filling with smoke. Dropping low to the floor, Ethan crawled into the haze, his instincts kicking in. Through the suffocating fog, he spotted the empty bed. A small, choked sob came from under the desk. "Matthew," Ethan called, his throat raw. "It's me. Grab my hand." A trembling little hand reached out from the darkness. Ethan grabbed it tightly, pulling the boy into his chest. "Let's get out of here, buddy," he whispered, shielding Matthew as he crawled back toward the hallway. When he emerged, the ceiling above them groaned, and a flaming beam crashed down in front of the stairs. No way back. No time. Ethan clutched Matthew close and ran straight for the living room window. With a kick, he shattered the glass, not caring about the shards slicing his arms and legs. "Close your eyes," he roared, and leapt. They hit the dewy grass outside hard, Ethan taking the full brunt of the fall to protect Matthew. Pain seared through his shoulder, his back, but the small boy in his arms was crying, trembling, and alive. That was all that mattered. Grace had led Ella, Sophie, and Jackson to the open field near the lake. When she saw Ethan emerge from the smoke, clutching Matthew, she screamed and sprinted toward them. "Oh my God," she sobbed, falling to her knees beside them. Ethan looked up at her, his face smeared with soot, his eyes bloodshot. "He's okay. He's safe," he rasped, trying to stand. But his knees buckled under him. The fire trucks arrived then, sirens wailing, red and blue lights flashing across the night sky. Sheriff Morgan rushed over with 2 firefighters, lifting Ethan onto a stretcher. "Second-degree burns," one firefighter called out, checking. "Quickly. We need to move now." Grace clutched Ethan's hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm here. I'm right here," she kept whispering, over and over, like a prayer. Ethan gave a faint smile, whispering only to her. "As long as you and the kids are safe, I'll be fine." And then the world around him faded into black. The next morning, Maple Hollow's small hospital overflowed with flowers and cards. News of Ethan Caldwell, the former millionaire who had once lost everything and now risked his life for 4 children, spread like wildfire across town. The newspapers called him the silent hero. But to Grace and the children, he was simply home, their anchor, the man who had placed their lives above his own without hesitation. When Ethan opened his eyes for the first time in the hospital room, Grace was there, her hand wrapped tightly around his. "We still have each other," she whispered, tears shimmering in her eyes. "The house is gone, but our real home is right here." Ethan gave a weak smile, his burned hand squeezing hers back. And deep in his heart, a silent vow echoed. No matter what, he would never lose them again. Morning sunlight streamed through the thin hospital curtains, painting pale streaks of light across Ethan Caldwell's face. Every breath he drew felt like an effort, but for the first time in days, his eyes opened, clear and aware. And the first thing he saw was Grace, slumped over the side of the bed, her hand clutching his, her thin face etched deep with worry. "Good morning," Ethan rasped. Grace jolted awake, tears immediately spilling down her cheeks. But this time, they were tears of relief. "You're awake," she choked out, gripping his hand tighter. "You scared me to death." A weak smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "And the kids?" "Safe," Grace whispered. "All of them, thanks to you." As Ethan fought day by day to heal, Maple Hollow began its own battle. News of the arson spread quickly. Although the police didn't have enough evidence to formally charge Richard Hamilton, no one in town doubted who was behind it, and not a single soul turned away. Sheriff Davis, Martha from the library, Mr. Jenkins from the flower shop, even people Ethan barely knew from the town cafe, all stepped forward. A group of carpenters, electricians, and builders formed a plan to rebuild the house. Someone donated wood, someone gathered old supplies, someone else cooked meals for the workers. Under the old maple tree where the front yard used to be, a hand-painted sign went up. "Hope House Project, starting today." Every day, Grace brought little updates to Ethan's hospital room. "Mr. Jenkins is redesigning the garden," she said once, wonder in her voice. "Says the kids will need a pumpkin patch come fall." Ethan closed his eyes, picturing little muddy hands tending tiny rows of pumpkins, a vision he once thought he'd only ever dream of. Sometimes, the physical pain nearly crushed him. But Grace, steady, luminous Grace, pulled him back inch by inch. The kids' visits helped too. Ella, Sophie, and Ben would burst into his room, arms full of messy crayon drawings. New houses, superhero Ethan cartoons, bringing the kind of medicine no hospital could provide. "I believe you'll get better," Sophie whispered once, placing a picture in his lap. "You still have to teach us how to build a treehouse." Ethan chuckled softly, every movement still burning his battered body. "You bet, kiddo," he promised. But outside, Richard wasn't sitting still. 1 week after the fire, a man in a black suit, one of Richard's representatives, showed up at the hospital. He brought a contract, a large sum of money, a distant house, a promise of safety for Grace and the children. The price? Leave Maple Hollow and Ethan forever. Grace looked at the papers, then at the stranger's smug face. She didn't hesitate. She shoved the document back toward him, voice steady. "Tell Richard, no amount of money will ever buy our lives again." The man smirked and left, leaving the crumpled contract on the hospital waiting room table. Grace's hands trembled, but her eyes were fiercer than ever. On the day Ethan was discharged, Maple Hollow was ablaze with autumn gold. His back was still heavily bandaged, and every step was slow and painful, but Ethan refused a wheelchair. He was going to walk into their new home, no matter what. Grace and the kids waited at the entrance, radiant smiles lighting their faces. A simple red ribbon stretched across the frame of the unfinished house, and Sheriff Davis handed Ethan a small pair of scissors. "Welcome home, Caldwell," the sheriff said, voice thick with emotion. Ethan cut the ribbon amid small cheers and clapping. Inside, the walls were still bare, the scent of fresh wood heavy in the air, sunlight pouring through unframed windows. But to Ethan, it was more beautiful than any mansion he had ever owned. Because this place was built with love by people who believed that family wasn't about bloodlines. It was about heart. That night, Ethan sat on the unfinished wooden floor, leaning back against a support beam, watching Grace and the kids play flashlight games in the dark. "Uncle Ethan," Ben giggled. "Make a ghost." Ethan chuckled low, casting a dragon-shaped shadow on the wall with his hands. Ella and Sophie collapsed into fits of laughter. Grace sat down beside him, handing him a mug of hot cocoa. "I've never seen them laugh like this," she whispered. "They have a reason now," Ethan murmured, his eyes soft. "They have their mother. They have a home. And you," he paused, his voice catching, "you have me." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, no more words needed. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, singing a quiet hymn of blessing. And under that unfinished roof, they weren't just building a house anymore. They were building something stronger than wood and stone. A family, a faith, a brand new life. The last leaves of autumn drifted across the courthouse yard in Maple Hollow as Ethan Caldwell stepped out of his battered pickup truck. Grace Hamilton was already waiting, her face set with determination, though her hands were tightly clasped together in nervousness. Inside the courthouse, the real battle awaited them. Richard Hamilton had hired a team of city lawyers, sharp suits, expensive leather briefcases, and cold, calculating smiles. They hadn't come seeking justice. They had come to crush. "I don't want the kids dragged into court," Grace whispered as Ethan joined her. "We'll do everything we can to prevent that," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. He reached out and took her hand, pouring into her a calm he hadn't even realized he possessed. Until now. The trial opened with Richard's polished lies. He was the devoted father, the betrayed husband whose wife had selfishly run away. He only wanted to reunite for the best interests of the children. The lies flowed from Richard's lips as easily as breathing. Ethan sat silently at the defense table, his hand gripping Grace's beneath it. He could feel her trembling, but he could also feel the fire simmering within her. The fierce will of a mother ready to fight to the very end. When it was their turn, Grace's lawyer, a small but razor-sharp woman named Martha Reeves, began her counterattack. Not with empty words, but with truth. Medical records documenting Grace's and the children's injuries. Police reports Grace had once been too afraid to pursue. Psychological evaluations confirming the devastating effects of emotional abuse. But the strongest evidence wasn't in the paperwork. It came from the people of Maple Hollow. Martha Grayson, the town librarian, took the witness stand first. "I've seen Grace's children," she said, voice thick with emotion. "In just a few weeks here, they've bloomed like flowers, finally given water after a long drought." Coach Miller from the Youth Soccer League testified that Emma, the eldest who once clung to the edges of the field in fear, now led her team with passion and confidence. Sheriff Davis stood, holding a report on the arson, and a copy of a contractor's invoice signed under one of Richard's known aliases. "We have reason to believe Mr. Hamilton was directly involved in the fire," Davis said bluntly, locking eyes with Richard. Richard glared at the room, but this time, money couldn't save him. Every slanderous claim he made was shattered by the small but powerful actions of a community. A shared meal, an afternoon spent planting a garden, the sound of a child laughing freely on a soccer field. Those were things money could never buy. At the tensest moment, when the prosecution tried a motion for Grace's temporary separation from her children, Ethan unexpectedly stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and clear through the heavy silence. "I request permission to speak." The judge, a silver-haired man with kind but discerning eyes, nodded. Ethan walked to the center of the courtroom, glancing briefly at Grace, Ella, Sophie, and Ben sitting behind him. "I have no blood ties to these children," Ethan began, his voice unwavering. "But I have seen the fear leave their eyes. I have heard their laughter return. I have watched a mother, once trembling with fear, stand like a shield against the storm." He turned toward Richard, his gaze steely. "No true father manipulates, threatens, or destroys his children's lives for the sake of control." Ethan paused, letting the words sink deep. "Family," he finished, "isn't about where you come from. Family is about who stays. And I choose to stay with them." A long, charged silence hung over the courtroom. Then a few scattered claps. Then more, until the room filled with quiet applause. The judge banged his gavel for order, but a small, knowing smile crossed his lips. A few days later, the ruling came down. Grace Hamilton was granted full custody of the children. Richard Hamilton's visitation rights were limited to supervised, heavily restricted sessions. Any future threats or harassment would be met with immediate criminal charges. Grace sat frozen as the judgment was read, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. Ethan pulled her into his arms, with Ella, Sophie, and Ben gathering close around them, a family without needing any more words. That night, in the unfinished frame of their rebuilding home, the six of them gathered around a makeshift wooden table. There was only toasted bread, potato soup, and a small apple pie. But to them, it was a feast fit for royalty. Ella stood, raising her glass of milk. "I want to thank Uncle Ethan and Mama Grace for never giving up on us." Sophie chimed in, "And for giving us a real home." Ben whispered shyly, "And for giving me a dad." Under the table, Ethan squeezed Grace's hand gently. And in that simple, humble moment, he knew every loss, every scar, every fall had led to this. A family, a new beginning, a vow that needed no words. The winter sunrise spilled over the pine-covered hills surrounding the town of Maple Hollow, painting the sky in soft shades of orange. Inside the newly built cottage, Ethan Caldwell sat at the kitchen table, slowly turning a coffee cup in his hands, his eyes resting on a blank sheet of paper before him. Since the trial, their lives had entered a new chapter, quieter but filled with bigger questions. How do you begin again? How do you build something worthy from the wreckage? Are you sketching something? Grace's voice floated over from behind him, warm as a morning breath. Ethan smiled and motioned for her to sit down. "Just an idea," he said, pushing the paper toward her. Grace tilted her head, reading, "Haven Innovations, Designing for a Better Life." Beneath it were rough sketches, lightweight leg braces, adjustable handrails for the elderly, compact but durable wheelchairs. Grace traced the lines with her fingertip, silent for a long moment. Is this your dream? She asked softly. No, Ethan said, his voice low and certain. It's our dream. A safe place to start again, like a haven. They began with the smallest things. Ethan sold the last Rolex watch he had kept from his CEO days. Grace opened her first joint bank account. Her name placed equally beside a man who didn't try to control her. They built a workshop next to the house. Just a tin roof and wooden walls, nothing fancy, but filled with the sounds of hammering, laughter, and dreams. Ben, Sophie, and Ella became their unofficial design assistants, eagerly suggesting new ideas. Sophie wanted a walking cane with LED lights to help Grandma at the market. Ben drew a mini cart for little people. Ella dreamed of rocking chairs designed safely for children with disabilities. Ethan saved every crooked drawing in a wooden box by his workbench. Because, he told the kids, every great invention starts with an innocent dream. The first orders came from friends in town. A lightweight folding wheelchair for Mrs. Martha Grayson. Custom handrails for Mr. Miller, who had just undergone knee surgery. And then, unexpectedly, an order from a neighboring county's community center. Word spread. Unlike big corporations that sold mass-market products, Ethan and Grace listened to each person. They adjusted heights, chose materials based on individual needs. They personalized each piece, names engraved by hand, favorite colors added with care. We don't sell products, Ethan said at the first town meeting. We give people back their freedom. But success didn't come without trials. One afternoon, Ethan frowned at the laptop screen. What is it? Grace asked, setting down a tray of freshly baked bread. Materials costs doubled this month, Ethan sighed. If we don't find a way to boost orders, we'll have to pause some of our free projects. Grace quietly poured him more coffee. Maybe, she said slowly, maybe we should try entering the state innovation fair. Ethan arched an eyebrow. Well, you know how I feel about crowds. Grace smiled. True, but you've never walked away from a real chance either. A week later, they stood in the bustling State Capitol Convention Center at a booth built from recycled wood under a hand-painted sign. Haven Innovations, Rebuilding Hope. At first, people passed them by, dazzled by shinier booths. But then, an elderly man with a cane wandered over, curious about Haven's rotating handrail design. He tried it. He smiled. He brought friends. By midday, a team of rehabilitation specialists approached them for business cards. By evening, Ethan and Grace had secured 5 trial orders. The road ahead was still steep, but for the first time in years, Ethan felt something new. Not flickering, fragile hope, but a steady, burning belief. That night, back in their little house, they threw a victory party with homemade pizza and lemonade. Jackson and Ella sketched plans for a bigger workshop. Ben and Sophie colored signs that read, "Welcome, first customers." When the children finally drifted off to sleep, Ethan and Grace sat on the front porch. The night sky above them glittered with stars. Grace leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, her breath as soft as the wind over the meadow. "Are you scared?" she asked. Terrified, Ethan admitted. Afraid of failing. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid of losing everything we found here. Grace tightened her grip on his hand. Me too. They sat in silence, letting fear and hope weave through them like rivers under winter ice. But deep down they both knew, no matter the storms, no matter the sleepless nights, they had found something worth fighting for in each other and in Haven Innovations. Not just a business, but new life, built with the truest parts of themselves. The last afternoon of April bathed the hillside behind the house in a soft golden light. There, a young oak tree, planted on the first day they moved onto the new land, stood a little taller, its tender leaves swaying gently in the spring breeze. The Promise Tree. That was the name the kids had given it, during a small ceremony with homemade cake and whispered dreams around its roots. Ethan stood beneath the sparse shade of the oak, his hand wrapped tightly around a small velvet box in his pocket. The wind played with his hair, carrying the scent of fresh grass and the laughter drifting from the wooden house, where Jackson and the kids were decorating for what they thought was just a celebration party for Haven Innovations. Grace didn't know. Not yet. She didn't know that tonight would be different. She didn't know that even though Ethan once believed he could never love again after his devastating loss, his heart had found its freedom once more. And this time, it chose her. The outdoor dinner was simple but filled with warmth. A long table was set under the oak, covered in a red and white checkered cloth. Mason jars overflowed with wildflowers Ella and Sophie had picked from the nearby fields. Jackson had strung fairy lights around the tree, their tiny bulbs twinkling like fallen stars. Ethan's throat tightened as he took in the scene, the children laughing as they fought over the last slice of cake. Grace gently scolding them with pride sparkling in her eyes. And beside it all, an empty chair waiting for him. He didn't need grand mansions, lavish parties, or million-dollar contracts. This was the life he had longed for. After dinner, Ethan stood, adjusting the collar of his shirt. The cool breeze brushed against his palms, already damp with sweat. "Jackson," he called softly. The boy instantly understood, winking at Ella, Sophie, and Ben. The kids quickly ushered Grace toward the oak tree, under the playful excuse of a treasure hunt. Grace laughed, going along with their excitement, suspecting nothing. When they stopped, she found herself standing beneath the promised tree, where every dream had been planted. And there, under the gently swaying branches, hung a string of small notes, shimmering under the fairy lights. Each note carried a message, a dream, a promise, written by the children and Ethan. Grace reached up, her hand trembling slightly, and read, "I promise to always protect my siblings. Jackson, I wish Mom would always smile like today. Ella, I want our family to always stay together. Ben, I love Mom and Uncle Ethan so much. Sophie." A soft, broken sob escaped Grace before she could stop it. Then Ethan stepped forward. He knelt down beneath the tree, the fairy lights catching in his eyes like a galaxy. In his hand was a simple ring, white gold, crowned with a deep blue sapphire, the color of trust, of loyalty that never fades. "Grace Hamilton," Ethan said, his voice raw with emotion, "I can't promise life will always be easy. I can't promise I'll always be perfect. But I promise to hold your hand through every storm. I promise to love your children as my own. I promise to lay each stone, dream by dream, until this place becomes our forever home." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely. Ethan smiled and opened the velvet box. "Will you be my family, Grace?" Time seemed to stretch, weightless, until Grace fell to her knees and threw her arms around him, laughing and sobbing all at once. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Cheers erupted from the children, shattering the emotional stillness. Jackson hugged Ethan from behind. Ella and Sophie clung to Grace. Ben bounced in excitement, clapping wildly. That night, under the promised tree, a true family was formed. No legal documents, no grandiose vows. Only love, only trust, only hands that held on tightly, even knowing the storms the world could bring. Ethan pulled Grace closer as the kids danced around them. And in his heart, he thought, "At last, after everything, I am home." Later that night, after the children had drifted into peaceful sleep, Ethan and Grace sat under the porch awning, gazing up at a sky thick with stars. "Do you still miss Sarah?" Grace asked softly, not with jealousy, but with pure understanding. "Always," Ethan answered truthfully. "She taught me that real love knows no boundaries." He turned toward Grace, his fingertip brushing away a tear still clinging to her cheek. "And you," he said, "you taught me that the heart can love again, deeper even, because of the losses we've endured." Grace wept again, this time tears made of pure hope. They sat together, letting the wind and stars bear silent witness to their new beginning. An imperfect beginning, but a whole one. And high above, among the young oak's branches, the little dream notes rustled in the night breeze, whispering, "We chose each other, and we will keep choosing each other forever." The brilliant golden light of spring stretched across the winding streets of Maple Hollow, where rows of cherry trees bloomed in soft pink and white like low-hanging clouds. The church bells echoed through the breeze, blending with the cheerful laughter spilling from porches strung with colorful flags. Today wasn't just the town's annual festival. It was something far more special for a small family that Maple Hollow had helped rebuild from the ashes, the Caldwell Hamilton family. On the North Hill, overlooking town, Ethan and Grace's new home. A cozy wooden house with a wide front porch and big windows gazing out toward the lake, buzzed with life. Flags fluttered in the breeze. A long table covered with a white cloth groaned under trays of baked goods, salads, and pitchers of lemonade. Children darted under the young maple trees, sometimes pausing to chase a lively little dog barking excitedly. Ethan stood on the porch steps, a coffee cup in one hand and the other resting lightly around Jackson's shoulders, his 11-year-old son now nearly reaching his own height. Across the yard, Grace knelt to tie Ben's shoelaces while Ella and Sophie eagerly showed new friends the little campsite they had set up themselves. Ethan smiled softly. The scene was so simple, so perfect, it made his chest ache with happiness. Just a year ago, everything had been ashes and tears. Today, they had a home. They had a real family. At 11 o'clock sharp, Maple Hollow's mayor, Clara Thompson, stepped onto a small platform set up in the yard. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began in her warm, steady voice. "Today, we don't just celebrate the coming of spring. We celebrate something even greater, the power of human kindness." She turned to Ethan and Grace, her eyes shining with pride. "We witnessed them fall, and then rise even stronger. We saw children find their laughter again where once there was only fear. And today we celebrate not just a new house, but a new family standing firm in the heart of this community." Thunderous applause echoed across the hill. Ethan tightened his arm around Jackson, while Grace clutched Ella's hand, her eyes brimming with tears. After the speech, the crowd scattered to enjoy the outdoor feast. Sam Carter from the repair shop manned the barbecue, grilling his famous ribs. Miss Anna from the school brought a basket piled high with frosted cupcakes. Even Mrs. Millie, who had once scowled at Ethan's arrival in town, had baked a massive craggy apple pie. Grace moved through the yard, her pale blue dress fluttering in the breeze. Everywhere she went, she was greeted with hugs, handshakes, and heartfelt congratulations. No more wary glances. No more guarded smiles. Maple Hollow had truly opened its heart. Outside the new garage, Haven Innovations proudly displayed its first products. Affordable medical aids Ethan and Grace had designed together. Lightweight folding wheelchairs. Sturdy but gentle walkers for the elderly. Custom orthopedic shoes for children. Ethan listened intently as Robert Winters, a retired veteran, tested one of their frames. "My legs aren't what they used to be," Robert chuckled. "But with this frame, I can still walk to church every Sunday." "You're not just selling gear, son. You're giving us back a piece of our lives." The simple words made Ethan's eyes sting. Not awards, not headlines. It was these small victories that mattered most. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped to a honeyed hue, Jackson gathered everyone together. The boy, flushed with excitement, hoisted a handmade wooden sign. "Welcome home, Caldwell Hamilton family." The letters were crooked and uneven, but filled with so much love it made Grace cry openly as she hugged the children. Thank you, my sweethearts, and thank you, everyone." Ethan stepped beside her, kneeling before their circle of family and friends. From his pocket, he pulled a small gold key, the new key to their home, built from dreams, tears, and hope. He handed it, one by one, to Grace, Jackson, Ella, Sophie, and Ben. "One key for each of you," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because every one of you deserves to open this door, whenever you need it, whenever you want to come home." No one could hold back tears then. As twilight fell, Maple Hollow gathered around a great bonfire in the yard. A guitar strummed softly. Old folk songs, off-key but full of heart, rose into the night sky. Ethan draped a light jacket over Grace's shoulders, their hands finding each other out of instinct. Ben nestled sleepily against Ethan's side. Ella and Sophie whispered and giggled nearby. Jackson sat close to his father, his eyes glowing, as if cradling the entire starry sky in their depths. Family, not defined by blood, not measured in wealth, just a safe place to return to, arms that stayed open, hearts that kept loving, even through the darkest storms. Ethan squeezed Grace's hand and whispered, "We found home." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, smiling brightly under the firelight. "No," she said, her voice soft as a breeze. "We built home, together." Morning in Maple Hollow always carried a quiet peace, but today, for Ethan Caldwell, everything before him seemed to glow a little brighter. He stood on the porch, a warm ceramic mug in his hands, silently watching the sun rise over the lake, its surface sparkling as if dusted in gold. Behind him, inside the new wooden house, came the joyful noise of children scrambling for spots around the breakfast table. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of fresh-cut wood, cinnamon pastries, and the sound of simple, everyday life, something he hadn't even dared to dream a year ago. In his younger days, success had meant cold numbers flashing across Wall Street tickers, glass towers scraping the clouds, and cocktail parties where handshakes were firm but eyes rarely met with honesty. He had once owned everything, and then, in one ruthless blink, through greed and betrayal, he had lost it all. But now, standing in a modest kitchen filled with the clatter of cutlery, the rich aroma of coffee, and the bright laughter of Ella, Sophie, Ben, and Jackson, Ethan finally understood. The things money could buy had never been true success at all. "Who's clearing the table this morning?" Grace called from the kitchen, her tone teasing, though a playful smile tugged at her lips. She had all the spoons in the fridge. Ben shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Sophie, sending the table into fits of laughter. "It wasn't me. The fridge just sucked them in," Sophie cried, her wide eyes pleading for mercy. Ethan chuckled and handed Grace a fresh set of spoons. "I think we need to retrain our logistics team. I think we need a dishwasher first," Grace replied, flashing him a mischievous look. In these simple exchanges, in the warm, loving chaos, Ethan found something he had once lost, the pure joy of living. After breakfast, the whole family headed to the open patch of land behind the house, where Ethan planned to build a small greenhouse for organic gardening. "We'll grow everything ourselves," he said, handing out gardening gloves to the kids. Tomatoes, strawberries, zucchini, and a whole bed of flowers for Mom Grace. Ella eagerly turned over the soil, while Jackson carefully measured out straight rows. Ben, the youngest, dug small holes with focused patience, often glancing up at Ethan for encouragement. Ethan knelt beside him, guiding his small hands gently. "It doesn't have to be perfect, Ben," he said quietly, "as long as you do it with your whole heart." Such a simple lesson, yet one that lit something within Ethan himself. In his old world, his worth had been measured by ruthless perfection. Here, he was learning to accept and cherish the beautifully imperfect. By noon, Grace had laid out a simple picnic under the old maple tree. Sandwiches, fresh fruit, and cold lemonade. They sat together on plaid blankets, passing food back and forth, laughing and chatting about summer plans. "We should go camping by the lake," Ella suggested eagerly. "I want to learn how to paddle a boat," Sophie shouted, nearly dropping her sandwich. "I just want ice cream." "And fish balls," Ben added seriously, making everyone burst out laughing. Ethan looked around at the kids, then at Grace, smiling warmly beside him. He didn't need yachts. He didn't need luxury vacations. He didn't need awards or headlines. He just needed this. That afternoon, while Grace and the kids painted on the front porch, Ethan took a quiet walk into town. He stopped in front of Millie's Bakery, where a family photo now hung in the display window, taken on the day they finished their house. Beneath the photo, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Family isn't where you're born. It's where you're welcomed with all your heart." Ethan smiled. A few years ago, he could have filled walls with perfect pictures from glittering galas. Yet none had ever made him want to stop and stare like this one. That evening, as night draped itself over Maple Hollow, they built a small fire in the backyard. Ethan strummed his old guitar, the only possession he had kept from his former life, singing soft, simple songs. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. Ben dozed off in her lap. Ella and Sophie nestled close to Jackson, half listening to the stories he spun out of thin air. No one spoke of old wounds. No one counted the scars or the failures. They just lived in the today, grateful for the quiet miracle of togetherness. As Ethan watched the embers die down, he understood something clearly. Success wasn't a bank account. It wasn't stock options or status. It wasn't applause or trophies. Success was a full heart, not from what you owned, but from who you chose to share it with. And here, in this quiet corner of the world, Ethan had found everything he could ever want. No fanfare, no spotlight, just laughter, warm embraces, and the whispered promises. We're here, and we're not going anywhere. That morning, a thick mist still clung to the winding roads around Maple Hollow when Grace Hamilton received a thick envelope, stamped from an unfamiliar law office in the city. Ethan had gone out to the garden with Jackson and Ben to check on the newly built greenhouse, leaving Grace alone at the kitchen table. Soft beams of pale light filtered through the thin curtains, casting a cold, solemn glow across the envelope. Inside was an offer, an opportunity, or a trap, depending on how one chose to see it. Grace read and reread every line, her hands trembling slightly. Richard's proposal was simple. End all lawsuits. Accept a sum large enough to buy any life she wanted. A new house, tuition for all 3 children at prestigious private schools, a stable job in one of Reynolds Corporation's affiliated companies. All it required was one condition: leave Ethan Caldwell. No compromises. No halfway deals. A clean, permanent break. Grace folded the cold, heavy papers back together, feeling as though she had touched a blade of frozen steel. A perfect offer, if life were measured only by material wealth. Outside, Jackson's laughter rang out. Ben squealed with delight as Ethan hoisted him onto his shoulders. "I'm Superman now," the little boy shouted. Grace smiled, her heart aching with fierce tenderness. This was not something money could buy. No check, no mansion, no black credit card could ever purchase that laughter. That safety, that trust in her children's eyes when they looked at Ethan as a real father. That night, after the kids had fallen asleep, Grace sat on the front porch, holding the now-creased letter. She said nothing as Ethan sat down beside her, silent, patient, as he always was. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and trembling. "He made an offer," Grace began, her gaze fixed on the distant lake, where the scattered lights mirrored stars falling onto the water. Ethan didn't rush her. He simply nodded, letting her know he was listening. "Money, a house, a safe future for the kids," she continued. "All I have to do is leave." Silence settled between them, thick as the evening mist. Ethan closed his eyes, holding back a flood of emotion. He wasn't surprised. Richard Reynolds had never known love, only how to manipulate control by. Ethan turned to Grace, reading the pain and conflict in her eyes. But beneath it, he saw something stronger than he had ever seen before. "And what do you want to do?" he asked softly, giving her the choice, never demanding, never pleading. Grace turned to face him. In the dim light, her face was radiant, not with perfection, but with unwavering strength. "I already have everything I need," she whispered. "The kids found their laughter here. I found myself here. And I found you." A long breath escaped Ethan's chest, not from anxiety, but from the overwhelming release of hope. Grace tore the letter in half, letting the pieces drift away on the gentle night breeze. "I choose to stay," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Not out of duty, not out of fear, but out of love." Ethan squeezed her hand gently. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Their hearts spoke louder than words ever could. The next day, they took the kids camping by the lakeside woods. An old tent, a pile of firewood, marshmallows roasting on sticks, and ghost stories whispered around a crackling fire. Ethan watched Ella, Sophie, and Ben curled up in sleeping bags, their innocent faces lit by the fire's glow. He watched Jackson leaning against him, half asleep. He watched Grace, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, a soft, dreamlike smile on her lips. And in that moment, deeper than he had ever known, Ethan understood. Family isn't built by blood. Family is built by those who choose to stay, when walking away would be so much easier. The day Richard Reynolds finally left Maple Hollow, defeated, it wasn't because he lacked money or power. He lost because he never understood one simple truth. True love cannot be bought. It cannot be forced. It cannot be threatened. It can only be given freely, bravely, and completely. Fall passed and winter came. Snow blanketed the rooftops in white, but inside the small wooden house by the lake, warmth radiated from the fireplace, from the tight embraces, from whispered goodnights. Ethan and Grace, along with their children, stepped into a new chapter. Not perfect, but real. And somewhere under the promise tree, the leaves still whispered in the wind. True happiness is always a choice. And sometimes, simply choosing to stay is enough. Spring had wrapped Maple Hollow in a brand new coat, fields of fresh grass whispering in the breeze, and wildflowers crowding the narrow dirt roads in a riot of color. The wooden house of Ethan, Caldwell and Grace Hamilton nestled quietly among the maple trees. Soft kitchen, smoke curling into the morning sky like a peaceful greeting. But the most striking change wasn't in the scenery. It was in the sounds. Laughter, the thundering of little feet, and the pure, bright voices of children filled the wide stretch of land. Ella, Sophie, and Ben, at last, were truly becoming what they were meant to be. Just kids. One afternoon, Ethan sat on the front steps, a glass of iced tea in hand, watching the sun spill gold across the yard. Ben, the youngest, was busily building a fort from leftover planks. Ella and Sophie, faces flushed from the sun, shouted over each other as they scavenged for building materials, from fallen branches to a worn-out rug they found in the storage shed. Not far off, Jackson, Ethan's son, showed them how to tie sturdy knots to hold the fort together. Ethan smiled, warmth spreading through his chest. Just months ago, Ben would flinch at every loud voice. Ella would cling to the walls like a shadow. Sophie barely dared to laugh, as if even happiness could be punished. But now they were shouting, laughing, running wild and free. While the kids worked, Grace sat at a long wooden table under a maple tree, sketching new designs for Haven Innovations. She looked up and caught Ethan's gaze. And with just a small, knowing smile, they both understood. They had done the right thing. They had saved these small, fragile souls and themselves. That evening, after a dinner filled with laughter and the scent of fresh-baked bread, Jackson proposed an idea. "Let's camp out in the yard tonight," he said excitedly. Ben's eyes lit up. Ella and Sophie exchanged thrilled, yet hesitant, glances. Grace gently laid a hand on Ella's shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly. "You can try. We're right here." Ella bit her lip, thinking. Then slowly, she nodded. By nightfall, the tent was pitched, sleeping bags neatly lined up inside. Ethan built a small, safe fire ring. The sweet smell of roasting marshmallows and the soft strumming of his guitar filled the air, spinning the night into something magical. At some point, Ben drifted off, his little head slumped against Ethan's shoulder. Ella whispered to Grace, her voice barely audible. "Mom, for the first time, I'm not afraid of the dark." Grace hugged her tightly, tears shining in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tent flaps, waking the children with its golden warmth. Sophie, the quietest of them all, burst outside, waving her arms excitedly. "I see a rainbow. A rainbow, Mom." The whole family hurried out, crowding together as they looked up. Across the bright, clean sky, a double rainbow arched from the mountains all the way to the edge of the forest. Ethan squeezed Grace's hand and whispered, "This is a sign, a new beginning." Grace tightened her grip on his hand, feeling her heart beat with a fierce, beautiful hope. The days that followed passed in a kind of peace only those who had weathered storms could truly appreciate. Ella painted every afternoon beneath the maple tree, her drawings now alive with color. Cozy wooden houses, blooming gardens, families holding hands under bright suns. Sophie learned to swim at the town dock, coached by Jackson. Her shrieks of triumph echoed across the lake each time she floated a little farther, rippling through Maple Hollow. Ben, ever the dreamer, transformed the backyard into a grand kingdom of cardboard castles, knights, and dragons. Ethan built a small lakeside cabin, not perfect but sturdy, where the kids could play, dream, and, most importantly, just be children. One evening, after reading bedtime stories and kissing each child goodnight, Ethan lingered by their bedsides. In the soft glow of the nightlight, he saw Ben cuddled tight around an old teddy bear, a birthday gift from the Maple Hollow community. Ella smiled in her sleep. Sophie clutched Jackson's hand like an anchor. Ethan closed his eyes, silently giving thanks for the chance not just to love, but to protect, to be a shelter for these small, once battered hearts. Somewhere beyond the hills, Richard Reynolds was likely still chasing victories, high rises, and cold profits. But here, in this warm wooden house, real victories unfolded every single day. A child's laugh ringing out, a fear laid to rest, a tiny dream taking flight. And for Ethan, Grace, Ella, Sophie, Ben, and Jackson, that was the greatest miracle of all. The early summer breeze carried the scent of wild grass and fresh lumber from a new builds springing up around Maple Hollow. On the surface, the little town looked unchanged. Cafes still opened early. The bakery still filled the streets with the sweet aroma of bread and pastries. But beneath the calm, a fire was quietly burning. The fire of courage and of community. Richard Reynolds hadn't given up. He returned to Maple Hollow, this time not with overt threats, but with something far more insidious: whispered rumors, anonymous accusations, and promises of lucrative investments if the town turned its back on Ethan and Grace. Some wavered, but most remembered, who had run into the flames to save the children, who had stayed and rebuilt from ashes, without complaint, without demands, and who had truly earned their trust. A town meeting was called on a Thursday evening, held in the old, worn town hall usually reserved for autumn festivals and pie contests. That night, the hall was packed. Ethan and Grace sat in the middle row, the children nestled close, hands tightly intertwined. On the wooden stage, Mayor Brooks, a tall man with a voice like a church bell, banged the gavel sharply. "We're not here to negotiate with Richard Reynolds," he said, voice ringing with disdain. "We're here to decide what Maple Hollow stands for." A ripple of whispers swept through the room. Ethan could feel all eyes turning toward him, not with judgment, but with expectation, with support. Grace squeezed his hand as if to say, "I'm here." The first to rise was Martha Grayson, owner of the local grocery store. "I know Ethan Caldwell," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "When my old roof collapsed after the storm, he came and rebuilt it, without taking a dime." She paused, eyes hardening. "Richard Reynolds?" She scoffed. "I've never seen him lift a finger at any fundraiser or festival in this town." The room buzzed with murmured agreement. Next was Mr. Jenkins, the oldest resident in Maple Hollow, leaning heavily on his cane as he stood. "Grace Hamilton and her kids brought laughter back to my street, something I thought I'd never hear again. We won't sell Maple Hollow's heart to the highest bidder." The hall erupted in applause. Ethan rose, his heart pounding. He hadn't prepared a speech, only the truth. "I used to think I could do everything on my own," he began, his voice steady and low. "But life taught me otherwise. No one is truly strong without someone standing beside them." He looked down at Ella, Sophie, Ben, and Jackson, their wide, trusting eyes gazing up at him. "Grace taught me that. Our children taught me that. And so did all of you, Maple Hollow." He paused, letting the words settle. "If we let someone like Richard Reynolds buy our hearts with money, we won't just lose a fight, we'll lose our soul." The hall fell utterly silent. Then a single clap, then another, and then the entire room rose to its feet, roaring with applause. The next day, the signs started to appear. Ellie's Cafe hung a hand-painted sign: "Regulars welcome. Toxicity, kindly leave." Baker's gas station posted another: "No service for those who disrespect this community." Even the children joined the movement. Jackson, Ella, and others painted a giant mural on the library wall, depicting the promised tree surrounded by hands clasped together. The message was simple, clear. We are stronger together. Richard fumed. He hired lawyers to send threatening letters. He spread false stories in the big newspapers. But every move he made only strengthened the town's unity. One morning, Ethan and Grace received an envelope. Inside was a photo, a long-range shot of their house. A silent threat. Grace trembled, but Ethan only tightened his grip on her hand. "We are not alone," he reminded her. That very afternoon, Sheriff Grant, the town's police chief, led a group of volunteer patrols to install extra security cameras around their home, checking every corner. "If anyone tries something," Grant said with a grim smile, "they'll have to answer to all of Maple Hollow." That night, under the moonlight, the family gathered around the backyard fire pit. Ella strummed the guitar. Jackson told ghost stories, even though he was clearly the most scared. Ben drifted off, mumbling in his sleep against Grace's chest. Ethan wrapped an arm around Grace, feeling a complete peace he thought he might never find again. "Do you think we'll be all right?" Grace whispered. Ethan nodded. "We didn't just build a house, Grace," he said. "We built a community, a family, and no one can burn that down. Tomorrow might bring more challenges. Richard Reynolds might not give up easily. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of love, friendship, and unwavering trust, they knew no storm could ever uproot what they had planted with courage and open hearts. The gentle sunlight of early summer poured golden honey over the winding roads of Maple Hollow. Birdsong rang from the towering trees, blending with the clear, bright laughter rising from the lakeside field where the entire town had gathered for a special day. Today, there were no grand flags, no big band playing, just familiar faces, warm embraces, and hearts overflowing with love. Today, Ethan Caldwell and Grace Hamilton were stepping into an entirely new chapter of their lives. By the lakeshore, under the shade of the promised tree, the tree that had witnessed every scar, every hope, every rebirth, simple wooden chairs were, lined up neatly in 2 rows. White and pale yellow ribbons fluttered softly in the breeze. Wildflower garlands, lovingly woven by Ella and Sophie that morning, adorned every seat. Ethan stood beneath the tree, wearing a crisp white shirt, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Beside him, Jackson fussed with his tie, his young face alight with pride and emotion. "You okay, buddy?" Ethan asked, leaning down. Jackson nodded, swallowing hard. "I've never seen Mom smile like that," he whispered, and Ethan's heart swelled. Music began to drift through the air. A simple, tender melody played on Mr. Jenkins's old guitar, the town's oldest resident. And then Grace appeared. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, her brown hair falling naturally around her shoulders, a sprig of lavender tucked behind one ear. Ben held her hand tightly, giggling when he spotted Ethan. Ella and Sophie scattered handfuls of wildflowers along the path, forming a soft trail that led Grace to the man waiting for her. In that moment, all other sounds faded. Only the thundering of their hearts remained. Mayor Brooks, dressed in an old but neatly pressed suit, officiated the ceremony. He didn't read from formal script. He simply asked, "Ethan Caldwell, do you promise to build a life with Grace Hamilton? Not a perfect life, but a whole one, built on love and trust, in richness and in hardship, in health and in sickness." Ethan squeezed Grace's hand. "For all my days," he answered. And when it was Grace's turn, she did not hesitate. "I chose you the day you brought us home," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "And I will choose you every day after this one." When Ethan gently slipped a simple wooden ring, set with a small diamond repurposed from Grace's old ring, on her finger, the entire town erupted into cheers and applause. The children rushed forward, throwing their arms around Ethan and Grace. Jackson hugged Ethan from behind, whispering, "We're really a family now, aren't we?" Ethan knelt down, voice thick with emotion. "We are, son." The celebration spilled out by the lake, under the golden sunlight and the endless blue sky. Everyone had brought homemade dishes, Mrs. Grayson's pies, the miller's famous barbecue, Ellie's fruit salad from her shop. There are no fancy banners, no champagne fountains. Only genuine smiles, heartfelt embraces, and love stitched into every shared moment. Grace sat at a picnic table, watching the children play on the lawn. Ella racing Sophie, Ben riding on Jackson's shoulders, all of them laughing freely. She reached for Ethan's hand without needing to say a word. Their eyes met. The gaze of two people who had lost, who had fallen, and who had risen stronger, gentler than before. As the evening light softened to lavender, the crowd gathered beneath the promised tree to plant another sapling, this time suggested by Ella and Jackson. The family tree, Ella declared, cheeks flushed with excitement. Ethan handed Grace a small shovel. I think, he said with a soft laugh, we've still got a lot of seasons left to sow. Grace laughed through her tears, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. As twilight deepened, Ethan pulled Grace into a slow waltz under the rising moon, the children hooting and cheering in delight. There was no music, only the whisper of the breeze and the steady beating of two hearts. You know, Ethan murmured into her hair, I used to think success was measured by a career. Grace looked up, the moonlight reflected in her calm, deep eyes. And now, he said, tightening his arms around her, I know success is finding someone to walk through the storms with and to smile with in the sunlight. Grace smiled, tears glittering. Then we're successful after all. No, Ethan gerechtigamente. We're the luckiest people alive. That night, under a canopy of stars, Maple Hollow bore silent witness to one more quiet miracle. A family reborn. A life rebuilt with courage, love, and trust. Not perfect, but complete. And in every heart present that day, a simple, enduring truth took root. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life aren't what we chase, but what we're brave enough to hold on to when everything else falls apart. In today's ever-changing world, where fame, wealth, and power are often glorified beyond measure, the story of Ethan Caldwell and Grace Hamilton reminds us of timeless, simple truths: love, courage, and the strength of community. Ethan once had it all: a brilliant career, a solid reputation, but he lost everything to schemes and betrayal. Grace once believed that assets and status could guarantee a safe life for her children, until she realized that freedom, dignity, and peace were the things truly worth fighting for. They met at a time when both carried deep, invisible scars. One betrayed by the ruthless world of business, the other oppressed within the very walls meant to protect her. And their greatest lesson is a lesson for all of us. Happiness is not about what we own. It's about who we choose to walk beside. Amidst the wreckage and loss, they didn't seek perfection. They didn't wait for a miracle. Instead, they reached out, dared to trust, and rebuilt, brick by brick, with kindness, patience, and a fierce refusal to give up. In modern life, it's easy to get caught in the cycle of comparison, achievements, possessions, validation from others. But as Ethan and Grace showed, real worth lies in the simplest things. A shared meal filled with laughter, an embrace after a weary day, a home where the heart can finally rest. And beyond that, the strength of community, the selfless compassion of others, was the light that guided them. In an era where isolation and skepticism often run deep, their story serves as a quiet but powerful reminder. We cannot and should not walk alone. A single hand reaching out, a word of encouragement, a small act of kindness can change a life's course. If you're walking through difficult days, facing loss, or doubting the future, remember this: a new beginning doesn't require perfection. It only asks for a brave heart and a hand willing to grasp the chance to love again. And perhaps, just like Ethan and Grace, you'll find not just a house, but a true family, rising from the ashes where you once thought nothing could grow. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.